She pulled me into the pantry just minutes before the ceremony was set to begin. My wedding dress was still warm from the iron, my prayer cap pinned tight against my hair, and my hands smelled like the rose water my mother had pressed into my palms an hour earlier. My sister-in-law-to-be, Rebecca, closed the pantry door behind us so carefully it didn't even click. She looked at me with eyes I will never forget, steady, sad, old in a way that didn't match her face, and she said 7 words I have carried with me for over 50 years. Anna, you don't have to do this. I laughed. I actually laughed because I was 18 years old, and I thought she was nervous for me. I thought she was being dramatic. I thought she meant the ceremony itself, the long benches, the 4 hours of preaching, the hundreds of eyes watching me become a wife. I patted her hand like I was the older one, and I said, "I'll be fine, Rebecca. Don't worry." She did not let go of my arm. She held it tighter, and she said something else, something quieter, something that I would replay in my head almost every single day for the next 4 decades. Before I tell you what she said and what I learned far too late, let me introduce myself. My name is Anna, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where women like me finally tell the stories our community spent generations bearing. I am older now. I left the Old Order Amish in my 50s after a lifetime inside the Ordnung in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I am one of the few women my age who has walked out of that world, and what I carry with me is not just my own story, but the silence of every woman who came before me and never got to speak. If this story matters to you, please subscribe. Tap the like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps women like me reach women like you. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever been warned about something important and chosen not to hear it? Let me take you back to the world I was raised in, because to understand what happened to me, you have to understand where I came from. I grew up in the 1960s in a Lancaster County that the tourists never saw. The world was changing all around us. Cars were everywhere. Televisions glowed in every English window. Men were walking on the moon. And in our farmhouse, we still pumped water by hand. We still read by kerosene lamp. And the only sound at night was the slow breathing of cows in the barn, and my father's pipe creaking against his teeth. A girl my age in that world had exactly one path. School ended at the 8th grade. After that, you were trained for one job and one job only. Wife. You learned to cook for 30 people, then 50, then 150. You learned to sew your own dresses, to can 300 jars of vegetables in a single summer, to wake before the sun and work past dark without complaint. By 16, you were attending the Sunday night singings. By 17, a boy was driving you home in his courting buggy. By 18, if you were a good girl, and I was a very good girl, you were engaged. His name was Jonas. He was 22, the second son of one of the most respected families in our district. His father was an ordained minister. His mother was the kind of woman everyone called for help with a difficult birth. The match was not exactly arranged. We did not arrange marriages the way some communities do. But it was, encouraged, heavily encouraged. My mother smiled when his name came up. My father nodded when his buggy pulled into our lane. The whole community treated our courtship like a foregone conclusion before I had even decided I liked him. And here is the thing I have to be honest about. I did like him. He was tall, with serious dark eyes, and hands that already had the calluses of a man who would never be afraid of work. He brought me a wooden box he had carved himself for our third buggy ride. He said grace before every meal in a low, steady voice. In front of my parents, in front of his parents, in front of the bishop. He was exactly the kind of young man every Amish mother dreams her daughter will bring home. But Rebecca knew something I didn't. Rebecca was his older sister. She was 26 and already married for 7 years, with 4 children and a 5th on the way. She had grown up in that house with him. She had shared the supper table with him for 2 decades. She had seen who he was when the bishop was not looking, when the parents were not listening, when the doors of his family's farmhouse were closed and the kerosene lamps were turned down low. And on the morning of my wedding, she tried to give me the gift of her own buried childhood. She tried to tell me what she had seen. In the pantry, after she said, "You don't have to do this," after I laughed and patted her hand like a foolish little girl, she looked at the closed door behind me, and she leaned closer. She said, "Anna, I have to tell you something about my brother, and I need you to listen. He is not what he shows your parents. He is not what he shows the bishop. There is a temper in him that our family has kept hidden since he was a small boy. My father has covered for him. My mother has covered for him. And once you are married, there is no one left to cover for him but you." I stood there in my wedding dress, with my mother's rosewater still on my hands, and I felt the world tilt a little. But you know what I did. I closed the door on those words. I did it on purpose. I told myself Rebecca was jealous. I told myself she had her own troubles with her own husband, and she was projecting them onto me. I told myself a sister could not possibly know a man better than his future wife. I told myself my parents would never have agreed to this match if anything was wrong. I told myself the bishop would have known, the community would have known. Something so big could not possibly stay hidden in a community that watched every one of us so closely. I told myself many things in those final minutes before the ceremony. None of them were true. All of them were easier than what Rebecca was offering me. Because what Rebecca was offering me was not a warning. It was a door out of the only life I had ever been raised to want. And I was too young, too obedient, too well-trained to even see it as a door. I saw it as an insult. I patted her hand one more time. I said, "I love him, Rebecca. I'm going to be fine." And I walked out of that pantry, down the hall, and into the kitchen where 300 guests were waiting for me to begin the rest of my life. The ceremony lasted nearly 4 hours. I do not remember most of it. I remember the wooden bench pressing into the backs of my knees. I remember the bishop's voice rising and falling in the old High German. My generation could still understand, but our grandchildren cannot. I remember Jonas's face when we stood before the bishop, calm, certain, his eyes already looking past me to the life he had planned. And I remember Rebecca in the second row, her hands folded in her lap, her face perfectly composed, in the way an Amish woman's face is trained to be from the time she is a small child. She did not look at me once during the entire ceremony. I understand now what that took. To sit there and watch your brother marry a girl you had tried to save, and to keep your face still, because in our world a woman's face is not her own. It belongs to the community. Let me tell you about my wedding night, because this is the part where I should have understood. We had been given an upstairs bedroom in my parents' house. The bed was the one my grandfather had built. The quilt was the one my aunts had stitched at my engagement frolic. Downstairs, the last guests were finishing the leftover roast and the choufle pie. I could hear my father's voice through the floorboards, and I could hear someone laughing, and I could hear a chair scraping, and all of it felt very far away. Jonas closed the door. He did not look at me. He sat on the edge of the bed and began to unlace his boots with his back turned. I stood by the wash basin in my long cotton nightgown, my hair finally unpinned, falling down my back the way only he was now allowed to see it. I waited for him to say something, anything. I waited for him to look at me the way he had looked at me on our buggy rides, the careful, tender way that had made me think I knew him. He did not look up. He said, in a voice that was flat and tired, "Take off your nightgown." Just like that. Not a word of tenderness, not a hand on my face, not the nervous, fumbling young husband I had been quietly told to expect by the older married women in my life. And I stood there frozen because I had nothing, absolutely nothing, to compare this moment to. I did not know if this was normal. I did not know if this was how all men were on their wedding night. I did not know if my discomfort was my own failure of submission, my own hochmut, my own pride rising up against my husband, when the bishop had told me only hours earlier that a wife yields. So I obeyed. And what happened after that I am not going to describe in detail, because what happened is the kind of thing the older women in my life would have told me was simply a wife's duty. But I will tell you this. I cried into that quilt afterward, silently, because I had been trained from the time I was a child not to wake anyone in the house. And Jonas fell asleep with his back to me, and his breathing was even and untroubled. And somewhere downstairs my father was still laughing, and somewhere across the field Rebecca was lying in her own marriage bed, and I think she knew exactly what was happening in mine. The first year of our marriage taught me what Rebecca had been trying to say. The temper she had warned me about did not show itself all at once. It revealed itself slowly, in increments small enough that I could explain each one away. The first time he raised his voice at me, I had let the bread rise too long. The first time he gripped my arm hard enough to leave 4 small bruises shaped like his fingers, I had spoken in front of a visiting deacon when I should have stayed silent. The first time he frightened me badly enough that I locked myself in the milk house for an hour. I had asked him a question about money, which is something a wife in our world was never supposed to do. After every incident, he would be gentle for days. He would bring me wildflowers from the back pasture. He would touch my cheek at the supper table in a way that made my throat tighten, with something that was almost love and almost fear. And I could not tell the difference anymore. And here is what no one outside the Amish world understands. There was nowhere for me to go. There was no telephone in my house. There was no women's shelter I had ever heard of. There was no English friend I could call because I had no English friends. There was no bishop I could tell because the bishop was Jonas's father's closest friend in the ministry. There was no mother I could run home to because my mother would have walked me back to my husband's door and told me that marriage was hard and a wife endures. So I endured. For 41 years, we had 7 children. I buried 2 of them, one as an infant, one at 19, and I will not speak of them on this channel because their stories belong to them and not to me. I baked thousands of loaves of bread. I canned tens of thousands of jars of food. I sewed every dress my daughters ever wore until they were old enough to sew their own. I was, by every measure my community used, a good Amish wife. And Rebecca, my sister-in-law, watched me from across the church district for 41 years, and she never said, "I told you so." Not once. She would come to my kitchen sometimes, when Jonas was out in the fields, and she would sit at my table, and she would simply hold my hand. We did not need to speak. She knew. I knew she knew. That was the whole conversation. The thing that finally changed me was not a moment of violence. It was a moment of quiet. I was 57 years old. The youngest of my surviving children had just married and moved into her own home. The house was suddenly very still. I was washing a single plate in the sink, one plate, where for 40 years there had been 12, and I caught my reflection in the dark kitchen window. And I did not recognize the woman looking back at me. I did not know her. I had spent 4 decades being someone's daughter, and then someone's wife, and then someone's mother. And somewhere underneath all of it, there had been a girl named Anna, and I could not find her anymore. I went to Rebecca's house that afternoon. She was 73 by then, widowed, living with one of her daughters. I sat on her front porch and I said, "Rebecca, do you remember what you tried to tell me in the pantry?" She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes had not changed. Still steady, still sad, still older than her face. And she said, "Every day, Anna, every day for 50 years. I asked her how she had known, and she told me. She told me about her brother as a child, about the things she had seen behind closed doors, about the cousin who had broken her engagement to him years before I came along, and the way the family had quietly buried that story too. She told me about her own mother, who had known everything and had still smiled when Jonas brought me home, because in our world a daughter-in-law was a solution to a problem that was never spoken aloud. I left Jonas 6 months later. I'm not going to pretend it was simple. The shunning was immediate and total. My own children, the ones I had carried and birthed and raised and fed and clothed, most of them will not speak to me to this day. I sleep some nights with a physical ache in my chest that I have come to understand will never fully leave. The price of my freedom has been everything I once believed was my life. But here is what I have learned in the years since. In therapy with a kind woman who did not flinch at any of my stories, I learned words I had never been allowed to know: coercive control, emotional abuse, trauma bond. I learned that the gentleness after the cruelty was not love returning. It was the cycle tightening. I learned that what Rebecca tried to give me in that pantry was not a warning. It was a rescue. And I, at 18, was simply too well trained to recognize a rescue when it was standing right in front of me holding my arm. I think about that 18-year-old girl now with so much tenderness it almost breaks me. She was not stupid. She was not weak. She had been raised deliberately and systematically to mistrust her own perception and to trust the structure that was about to harm her. She had been told her whole life that a sister-in-law's worry was gossip, that a woman's intuition was Hochmut, that the bishop and the parents in the community always knew best. She had no language for what Rebecca was offering her. None of us did. None of us were ever given that language. The Amish world gave me real things. I will not pretend it did not. A faith that has survived even my leaving. A capacity for hard work that has carried me through every difficult year since I walked out. A community that for the first 57 years of my life knew my name and my history and my recipe for chow chow. Those things were real. I do not throw them away. But the Amish world also taught me that the older woman in the pantry, the sister-in-law with the steady eyes and the sad mouth, was the dangerous one, the disruptive one, the one whose voice should be ignored. And the truth is exactly the opposite. The dangerous one was the smiling young man with the calluses on his hands, and the bishop for a father, and Rebecca, who tried to save me at 18, and who held my hand in silence for 41 years afterward, was the bravest person I have ever known. If there is a woman in your life right now, an older sister, an aunt, a sister-in-law, a friend's mother who has pulled you aside and tried to tell you something about a man you love, I am begging you to do what I did not do. Do not laugh. Do not pat her hand. Do not tell yourself she is jealous or dramatic or wrong. Sit down, look her in the eyes, and let her finish the sentence. She is not trying to ruin your wedding. She is trying to give you back the next 40 years of your life. If this story stayed with you, please leave me a comment. Tell me about your own Rebecca, the woman who tried to warn you, or the woman you have tried to warn. Tell me where you are listening from. And if you want to hear more stories from behind the prayer cap, the ones we were never allowed to speak out loud, subscribe to Hannah, the Amish girl. I have so much more to tell you. Until next time, the women who try to save you are almost never the ones you should be afraid of. Choose carefully who you listen to. It might just save your life.